there in the bottom. Okay, so thanks again for everybody who's tuning in. I'm Ian Thomas Tafoya. I was appointed by the Speaker of the House for working with disproportionately impacted communities. My job is the Colorado State Director for Green Latinos, but I too personally grew up in an environmental justice community that was impacted, and the affordable housing was where the toxicity was. So today we have a good agenda. I'm glad to be working with everybody to help move this along. I know that it takes a little time to move the agenda along, but I just really want to say thanks to the staff, because I know they're doing this for a lot of different committees and working around different people's schedule. So we're going to start with just kind of a land acknowledgement. I think it's important, in particular, as we talk about this subcommittee and its relationship to the anti-Indigenous statements. Later today, we're actually going to be talking about different histories from different communities around Colorado, starting in the beginning, which was the people who were living here when the colonization began. I think it's really important that as we name these people, right, the Ute, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, Pueblo, Comanche, we recognize that most of these names are actually our names for these tribes. And I think that those readings, as I reviewed them, really reminded me of how important the level of respect is to call people by what they call themselves. And so I have myself kind of on a mission to try to learn how to say those different tribal names in their language, because I think that that's an important way of what Renee talks about, which is trying to do away with the erasure, right? Like we can't, part of the reason why we haven't been able to advance, I think, is because we haven't gotten past this stuff, because we try to ignore it instead of dealing with it, instead of talking about it. And so that's really what I just wanted to ground us with in the land acknowledgement today, is that I think we all have more work to do to level up on that level of respect. And I think that at the bigger conversation we had about tribal people and tribal consultation, I think that really brought that home for you and the history of it. So that being said, I think we wanted to start with this kind of an icebreaker for those that are on the task force, and really just kind of, have you worked in a disproportionately impacted community? Maybe you grew up in one like I did. And, tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's important for people to see how we're connected. I know that, the statutes called for us to be that, but I think it's another thing to for the listeners and all of us to see that work. So I guess I kind of did mine in my intro. I don't know, Robin, if you would mind going next.
Sure. Thank you, Ian, for that. That perspective is really appreciated. I am fortunate enough to have grown up in one of those sort of 50 style suburbs, right? And that doesn't really even exist anymore, but I have lived and worked in a number of communities that didn't look like the one I grew up in. And that is not unintentional. And I think my first really meaningful sort of bubble popping, right, was when I was in Washington, D.C. in law school. I taught a class called street law in a public high school in Northeast D.C. And street law was designed to bring education to classrooms that doesn't exist about, in a relatable way, about Fourth Amendment rights and how to negotiate rent, right? And how to learn about your credit and what that means. And, skills that I wasn't taught in school that I could have benefited from, and, and especially like privacy rights and how to interact with police in some of these communities. That education that's really important, but you're not going to find in a math book. So that was a really incredible and wonderful experience. And I did that for 2 years, every morning, taught first period. And I just learned, I had a lot of perspective shift and was really grateful to the students. And, this was a community while I was there that mercury was stolen from the science lab and put in all the water fountains at the school, and we were locked down while everybody had to get tested for and I think the biggest part of it was like sort of the level of, okay, yeah, like another thing, right, was really impactful. And that, started a lot of my interest in understanding like how, the environment and what it does to our bodies, and, how I could design a life of that focuses on education and improving health outcomes and environmental outcomes for people. So it had a really, really huge impact on me. And, I'm really excited to be a part of, of this effort.
Thanks, Robin, and welcome, Jaime. More than welcome to join in this conversation with us, of course. Just want to introduce you as a task force member. What we're doing is just doing an icebreaker about if we're from or how we work with disproportionately impacted communities. I'll give you a second for you to gather your thoughts, Jaime. I think Tyson was next.
I mean, you could have gave me more time to gather my thoughts too. Tyson Johnston, pronoun he, him. I grew up, it was just my mom and I growing up. I grew up with a single mom until I was about 8. She made very little money, but she moved us to an apartment complex that was in the Cherry Creek School District and would go get me clothes at the thrift store. So I looked like the kids and could go to the Cherry Creek schools and not be made fun of. My lessons growing up were that, no matter where you lived, there was always, a difference in how you were treated. My mom married who I call my dad now. He's my stepdad, but I call him my father. He adopted me when I was 12 years old, but they married when I was 8. We moved to Steamboat. He started a home building business. I helped him build houses, learn how to use tools. We spent a lot of time we lived out in rural Steamboat, where I got to know a different kind of disproportionately impacted community, which was the rural communities out in Steamboat. We spent a lot of time, whether it was helping fill up somebody's propane tank, going out and helping people mend fences, helping people rebuild their barns. There were a lot of people who were living very month to month in their life. They lived off the land as much as they could, and it was just another piece of my upbringing that brought me to where I am today. As I've gone through my career, I have enjoyed doing the hands-on work in communities, working with Habitat for Humanity and some other organizations to, put my hands on areas where I can help other disproportionately impacted individuals or communities. But as my kids now grow up, I'm trying to introduce them into the same type of thing. And because of the privileged life that I now live, I have to kind of force that on them, which is unfortunate, but that's part of making sure that my kids don't lose sight of this stuff. And that's a big part of where I am here today, is making sure that I am giving back to the community as much as I can, helping to learn and understand from everyone else, as well as something to get my kids on that same path of giving and making sure that they're doing everything in their power. I think one of the massive disadvantages of disproportionately impacted communities is the people who do get out of the communities and build a life for themselves, a lot of times don't come back to help, which leaves people stranded. And I spent a lot of time now over the last several years working in more of the urban communities to try and create opportunities for those in the urban communities. But all of this goes together to say that DI communities are everywhere, and they're integrated with everything that we do in our life. And whether you are in a DI community now or not, or have been in or haven't, everyone can help to make this world a better place. And it's a great place to start to help with people who have not had the opportunities that we may have had, or that may have been created for us. Because a lot of the reason why was able to get to where I am today is because of other people who gave me opportunities and helped me. Without that help, I wouldn't be where I am today. So I truly believe that time is, I have 4 kids. My life is busy. My wife is busy. She works full time. We are a crazy, crazy, crazy family, but it does not, the time that I spend here is just as valuable to me and to the example I set for my kids and to the help that we can do in the work, that I really value it that much. So thank you.
Thank you, Tyson, and welcome, Renee, also a task force member. Renee, we're just going through a prompt of if you're from or if you have experience working within DIC communities, and we're going to let Jaime go, so I think you can go after him if you'd like.
No worries. Thank you. Gentle afternoon, love.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. My name is Jaime Valdez. I also go as Jamie, or go by Jamie. I've grown up answering to both, so I don't necessarily have a preference. I am the Southern Colorado community organizer for Mothers Out Front, which is a climate justice organization working toward the goal of a livable climate for all children and future generations. I am also a Pueblo native and a longtime proud Chicano activist in this community. I have multi-generational roots in Southern Colorado. As I mentioned, I'm a proud Chicano activist, and as a part of that, I am part Jicarilla Apache and part Yaqui. Yaqui is not necessarily a tribe that is from around this area. It's more of a border tribe, but as we all know, a lot of tribal folks were displaced, and our cultures have been lost, our heritage and our bloodlines, and we really have to work to kind of learn about that. I myself didn't even really start to learn about my cultural background until I got into college. And so this is part of the ongoing trauma that our people face. Beyond that, I was born to a very strong single mother and into, like I say, a multicultural family. And at the age of 7 years old, my mom married into a Black family. And so I definitely have a depth of cultural diversity and a very rich upbringing and perspective, I think, on some of these issues. I have been the president of the Colorado University of Southern Colorado, CSU Pueblo, Colorado State University Pueblo chapter of the National Student Organization, MECHA. MECHA is an acronym, stands for El Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. This organization focuses on empowering the Latin American and indigenous communities to take part in the conversations that impact their lives through education. And so we try to increase enrollment in secondary education in the Latin American indigenous communities. And so this work is very much personal to me. It really goes back to my very roots. And so I'm happy to be a part of this action task force. And thank you all for joining us.
All right, Renee, I think you round us out. Go on to the next part.
Tlazokamati Amato, Tlazokamati Atatonatu, Tlazokamati Tanan Sintlali, Tlazokamati Abuelitos, the Abuelitas, and all the ones that came before, and all the little ones to come. I'm Renee Muller Chacon, I'm the Chicana and Filipina, and I'm a mom in this space. I come from a long line of a lot of women and aunties and matriarchs that, whether it was in ceremony or in social gatherings, have legitimately had to hold our own cultural identity. or how to hold our own communities that have been politicized. I grew up as a mestizo dancer, so ballet folklorico, and been protesting since I was 3 there. And then I went into Azteca danza, where I now hold the smoke for Capuli Coro Eslan, and I did in Barrio Logan at Chicano Park for Capuli Mexica and for Grupo Mexicayo, the only general right now in the United States, General Mario, to hold the smoke and teach cultural dances. Honestly, I'm from disproportionately impacted communities and local indigenous communities. My grandmother was part of the relocation space for her clan, which was the Nen Mexicanos, a Navajo and Mexican clan out of Pueblo Pintado. And she married my Filipino grandpa, who owned a shoe shop here that actually helped fund back in the day La Voz, which was a social justice paper, completely Spanish language when that didn't even exist. So I grew up a lot, and then my father, he actually fought the United States Post Office because of severe discrimination for the fact that he was just a guy in that space that wasn't okay with corruption, and became a union liaison and won a 10-year lawsuit that actually bought his home because of the type of corruption, and pointing that out specifically through just what was going on in federal funding at that time at the post office, and that was the one here off of Vasquez. So I grew up very much understanding where my community has been disproportioned and what does that mean to eliminate it from our own self-determination in relation to the biosphere and our own cultural identity, which is often erased. I now teach in understanding that in historical and cultural and even spiritual context. And I've been taught that from my own community because it doesn't exist in education. To this day, Colorado, even though there's land acknowledgements, there is barely room that is made in even our education system to understand where there's been cultural identity erasure, starting with indigenous communities, and how that still affects projection and biases in our policy making and how we just help or don't help our communities every day. So I've worked everything from delivering food shares and water from all over to understanding what it means to hold that responsibility that if it's not me to say something, how can I amplify those that do deserve to say something because they don't deserve their narrative hijacked after having dealt with such long overdue injustice. So I don't know, I'm in so many different circles anymore that prayer is my intention, and my intention is how I walk in the world. So oftentimes you do hear me start with a prayer because what I'm doing in this work is transformative. It's my way of life. It's not just that I'm here to change my community. I'm taking my generation's torch for this time to do it because so many have done it for me. And I don't necessarily want my children to have to do the same work. They should be able to transformatively change their own spaces from their own self-determination without so many barriers to their very identity or their health and safety. And I've been taught that through so many contexts in my lifetime that it's no longer teaching that I want to see. I really need legitimate action. And I know where there's been inaction and even ignorance to not address these spaces of equity from our own authentic, I guess, bridging in communities. So I do a lot of that specifically. And that takes a lot of looking at ourselves through conflict resolution and a lot of other ally and accomplished training and so many other forms of education. That in that too, I got a master's in cultural education and transformative educational leadership through Northern Arizona University, which was one of the first to do it through Dene and Navajo indigenous knowledge and integrate that in a higher institution. So every way that I can reflect that in my own identity as authentic as I can and support those that do, that's what I've been taught. And that's what I plan on doing as just a mom. I do it from the basis as what that means as a life giver, as a femme identity, and rematriating a society that often doesn't already let women have that empowerment, much less that cultural identity if you're in any other space or marginalization. So I appreciate being in these spaces and on the Environmental Justice Task Force and how we can integrate equity, but we also have to keep it within context that it's been long overdue for, especially for indigenous communities, to even have that reclamation, or we wouldn't still be on stolen land and with stolen resources and sources of life. So I'm really grateful in being a part of, I guess, social justice is climate justice and climate justice is social justice. But it's finally time to do something because our future generations deserve the respect as well, just as much as our ancestors did. I thank you for just hearing and listening to that in any way that I can expand that. Do let me know. Thank you.
Great, Renee. Thank you so much. And I know we're a little over time on our projected agenda, but that's just how life is sometimes. Sometimes it takes a little longer, but I appreciate everyone sharing their connection, their commitment to the work. I think it's a good perspective for us all to have, I think, as we're going in to talk about what these definitions mean. You're seeing here all these different kind of backgrounds, right? But still we found our way to working in this work. And I think that's true for all sorts of rulemakings and permitting, that different backgrounds bring different people forward. So we had sent we made a decision last month to bring people in to talk about the different definitions of disproportionately impacted communities, how they are used in their community. And that was all shared there in a spreadsheet. I know that we're gonna flip the schedule around a little bit, and I think we might recap what we talked about last month as we go along. And I just want to remind people that, you know, if you want to find information about the last meeting, you can go into the files. I think Lubna is going to drop a link here for people. With that being said, Joel, is it the first person we were going to have speak was Sabrina Trask with COGCC. And I didn't know, are you starting with kind of the slideshow comparison?
Sure. Yeah, Ian, I'm happy to kind of show that to everyone to kick us off and then turn it over to Sabrina. So I will just kind of quickly put that on my screen, and I'm sure that actually Lubna can share that in the chat as well, so that everyone can find what I'm sharing on the Google Drive. It's a lot of text. So just as a reminder, this is the slide that you all saw last meeting that we created for the meeting. This shows kind of what the different definitions of disproportionately impacted community are across different state agencies, which are the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment, or CDPHE, the Colorado Department of Transportation, or CDOT, the Public Utilities Commission, or PUC, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, or CPW, or in the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, or COGCC. And I'll pause for a moment. That was a lot of acronyms, so let our interpreters catch up. Since the last meeting, we've also added a new slide at the suggestion of all of you, the task force members, that actually kind of shows how those definitions are applied. So not just what the definition is, but what this actually means in context, how all these different agencies are actually taking this definition and doing something with it. So and what it means in the scope of their laws and regulations. So that's what our speakers are here to speak to tonight. We have speakers from the Oil and Gas Commission, from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, from the Public Utilities Commission, and then of course Robin, who's on the task force subcommittee, to speak to the Air Quality Control Commission requirements. So we'll kind of go through everyone, I think, in that order, and they'll tell you a little bit more about how their agency is implementing the definition of disproportionately impacted community. And that, I think I'll turn it over to Sabrina to get us started. And then I'll just quickly say, as a quick reminder to all our agency presenters, to please try to avoid acronyms if you possibly can, or at least give a nice long pause after you do, because that can make the interpretation really challenging, because those acronyms often don't make sense in Spanish. So with that, Sabrina, please go ahead.
Great, thank you, Joel. Shall I share my slides, or are you gonna run my slides?
Yeah, I can run them for you.
Thank you. You'd think after 2 years of working from home, I'd figure out how to run my own slides. So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here with you today. My name is Sabrina Trask, and I'm the Planning and Permitting Manager at the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. I have just a couple of slides today to discuss COGCC's definition of disproportionately impacted communities and how we apply that definition in our permitting considerations. Next slide, please, Joel. So just a quick overview. Who is the COGCC, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission? That's a mouthful. I'll talk about that briefly, and then go into the details about our mission change rulemaking in 2019, our definition of disproportionately impacted community. I'll show an example of our GIS mapping of DI communities, And I'll talk a little bit about how we apply this in our permitting considerations. Next slide, please, Joel. The Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission is a state agency. It is embedded within the Department of Natural Resources. The COGCC has the authority over oil and gas operations throughout the state of Colorado. Oil and gas operations includes the drilling of oil and gas wells, completing or fracking oil and gas wells, and producing oil and gas minerals from those wells. The work that staff does includes permitting new oil and gas locations and operations. We also have a large enforcement team, including field inspectors that go out and make sure that oil and gas operators are in compliance with our rules. We have a robust environmental team. These are the folks that are in charge of remediation of spills or releases or other environmental impacts. We have a reclamation team. This is when these are the folks that go out in the field when a well is plugged and abandoned. The reclamation team ensures that the abandonment is successful, the well integrity is successful, and the surface of the land is restored with proper vegetation, wetlands, wildlife habitat, really trying to reclaim and restore the land to its original quality. And we also have an orphaned wells program. You might have heard about the orphaned wells program lately. We've been in the news. There's been a recent a large sum of federal grant money has become available. And so our orphaned wells program is expanding in the near future. One thing that the Oil and Gas Commission does not do is we don't have authority over pipelines. Pipelines are under the authority of the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA. So a little bit of nuance there. Next slide, please. You've probably heard about our mission change rulemaking. Senate Bill 19-181 was passed in April of 2019. And significantly for the commission, it changed our mission statement from fostering the development of oil and gas to regulating the development of oil and gas, and specifically in a manner that prioritizes the protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. We did undertake a very large rulemaking process between 2019 and 2020. And I especially want to give Joel a shout out. He was a critical leader throughout that process and really helped bring the COGCC sort of into modern rulemaking. Joel pushed really hard for us to bring DI communities into our 100 series definition. So thank you, Joel, for that. We did incorporate disproportionately impacted communities into our 100 series and throughout our mission change rules. This is the first time that DI communities have been considered in oil and gas operations in Colorado. And I'm not positive, but I want to say that Colorado might be the first state that has included DI communities in their oil and gas regulatory regime. I'm not sure about that, but if it's not the first, it's one of the first. The new rules went into effect on January 15th of 2021. So we've been implementing the new rules for just over a year now. Next slide, please. So I want to take a moment to define DI community as defined in the Commission's rules. We did land in the rulemaking on using the EPA's definition of minority, and we're using US Census block groups for the level of geographic area and its associated census data. So within the definition of DI community, there's 4 different characteristics. The first characteristic is that if a block group's population is more than 50% minority, then it is considered a DI community. Another criteria is if the percent minority population in a block group is greater than that of the county, it is considered a DI community. And that I want to just take a moment to give sort of an example, because that's not always intuitive. So the example is if Weld County has a minority population of 33%, and that's, I don't know that that's the current number, but that's the number from rulemaking a couple of years ago. So if Weld County has overall a minority population of 33%, then any block group that has a minority population greater than 33% would be recognized as a disproportionately impacted community. The third criteria for a DI community is any block group that has a median household income that is equal to or less than 200% of the federal poverty guideline. And then the fourth is any block group in which 20% or more of the population is linguistically isolated. So I want to make sure to clarify that within this rule, this definition, a block group is defined as a disproportionately impacted community if it meets any one of these criteria. It does not have to meet all four of them. So any one of these criteria alone will quantify or qualify that block group as a disproportionately impacted community. The data that we're using, that we've incorporated in our rule, comes from the American Community Survey, or ACS, and the poverty guideline is from the Department of Health and Human Services. We do encourage the commissioners to consider updating the data sets annually or at some other interval. That has to be undertaken through a rulemaking. Next slide, please. I wanted to get something other than just words in my presentation, a little bit of color. So there are four sort of small inset maps shown here. Our GIS team was able to take the ACS data from the tables and translate it into map layers on our GIS map. Our GIS map on our website is used by staff every day, and it is available to the public every day. So it's a really useful tool, both for staff and for the public, for just general curiosity. So the four small inset maps, they're all basically the same area. The area is about 3 miles north to south and about 2 miles east to west. And the four different maps show the four different sort of designations of disproportionately impacted communities. So for example, the yellow map, the map that has the yellow colors on it, those block groups are those that have a median income less than 200% of the federal poverty guideline. The larger map to the right side of the screen shows all four of those distinct characteristics, all four of those layers. I've added an aerial image underneath it so you can see sort of in the lower left corner, there's a very densely populated neighborhood. And then sort of at the far northern, the top edge of the map, there's some farm fields and more residential rural area. There are some green blobs, for lack of a better word. You can see on the sort of the top half of the map, some small green blobs. Those blobs are existing oil and gas locations. Those are well pads or tank batteries. And so this gives you a really good example of how we would use this mapping tool, where we can see the spatial relationship between existing oil and gas locations and disproportionately impacted communities. We use this so that we can better understand the nexus of potential adverse impacts and cumulative impacts to these communities. So staff uses this mapping tool every day, very frequently. in review of every permit application that we receive from oil and gas operators. If a proposed new well pad is within or proximate to a DI community, we need to know that because there are additional permit requirements for that operator to comply with if they want to conduct operations within or near a disproportionately impacted community. Next slide, please. So what are some of these permitting considerations? For a permit application that proposes a new location or proposes expanding an existing location that is within 2,000 feet of a residential building unit or a house, a home that is in a DI community, there's a longer public comment period. Normally it's 30 days, but for locations proposed within 2,000 feet of a home in a DI community, it's 45 days. An alternative location analysis, or ALA, is also required. The ALA is a very robust planning tool that forces the applicant to seek and evaluate alternative locations that might better avoid disproportionately impacted communities. A disproportionately impacted community map is also required as part of the application. This map is basically a printed map version of our GIS map to show the spatial relationship between the proposed well pad and the boundaries of the nearest disproportionately impacted community or the nearest affected block group. And one of, I think, my favorite pieces of this is the community outreach plan is also required. This plan will demonstrate, the applicant will demonstrate how they've engaged in community outreach, in shared consultation, two-way dialogue with residents, and transparency with community members. So there are some rule-based components that are required within the community outreach plan. These include a robust description of any best management practices, or BMPs, that are proposed to minimize or mitigate adverse impacts. The applicant must demonstrate that they've provided information and access to information in all languages spoken by 5% or more of the people in that block group. And the plan must also demonstrate how any past or future public meetings, such as an open house or a community town hall, either that was held or is going to be held, will be at a location within that DI community or close to the DI community in order to alleviate potential issues with attendees having access to transportation to even attend the meeting. The plan must also demonstrate the applicant's ability to provide for childcare and interpretive services at these community meetings upon request of any potential meeting participants. Next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide. So aside from those permitting requirements, we have a few additional ones. For any proposed location that is within a DI community, within a block group, there is a longer consultation period from 40 days up to 60 days. These consultations are meant to be with other state agencies such as CDPHE or Colorado Parks and Wildlife, local governments, or public water system administrators. This is to ensure that additional BMPs or community outreach or feedback or input can be received and communicated and shared with the residents within that DI community. For every proposed oil and gas development plan, so whether it's in or near a DI community or not, applicants are required to provide at a minimum the distance to the nearest DI community and a robust analysis of their estimated cumulative impacts to public health. So this includes estimates of air emissions of dust and noise and light and odor, what we call the nuisance impacts, impacts to high priority habitats and other related wildlife habitats through CPW, surface water and groundwater impacts. So all of that is captured in our Form 2B, which is the cumulative impact data identification, and goes into a database basically that we will write an annual report every year that reviews and evaluates and discusses the cumulative impacts that have been estimated by planned oil and gas operations throughout the year. We've just released our first annual report. It came out January 15th of this year. It was fairly small. We only had approved 7 permits under the new rules. So in the last year, only 7 permits were approved. And so only 7 data points, not a lot of data points yet, but it will grow into a very useful tool. And then the last type of permit that we have is called a comprehensive area plan, or a CAP. This is a large scale landscape level integrated planning tool for multiple locations. We would anticipate that the applicant will include the overall infrastructure, utility and pipeline corridors, a much bigger picture, not just one well pad, but many well pads that have had a very in-depth and integrated planning period. So every comprehensive plan comprehensive area plan application that we receive requires a lot of the same information about DI communities. So distances to DI communities, cumulative impacts, mitigation measures to preferably avoid, but if not avoid, then minimize and mitigate impacts to DI communities. I think that's all that I have. I'm happy to take questions. I do have to apologize. I'm in my job, I'm in the middle of a hearing right now, so I had to leave the hearing, jump over here. And so I apologize. I do need to leave and go back to the hearing. I communicated this with Joel. I am so happy to take any questions. I just won't be able to take them live. So if you could forward them to Joel and he can forward them to me, I will make a point to answer those questions within the next 24 hours. So thank you very much. Again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina, and we really appreciate that and providing your presentation. And I'm absolutely more than happy to relay all those questions to Sabrina if we have them. So thank you for leaving your hearing to come to our hearing.
Okay. Thanks, I appreciate it. Bye-bye, everybody.
Since we have a note taker right now, are there any questions anyone wants to throw out that they'd like to have answered? So you don't have to type them when you're not in this meeting, which I know is like, oh, another thing I have to do if I want to get my input in. One of the questions that I had is like, what kind of staff implications is this? And like, you know, they're saying every single one of these plans needs to have all these pieces. And I'm thinking like, how much extra time is that to like review? Is it actually accomplishing what it's trying to do? Or is it just a goal that's not resourced enough? And so I kind of thought I was going to ask a question about that.
It's a great question, Ian. And I know that we should send that to Sabrina. I know that COGCC did actually have, the Oil and Gas Commission did have to rework its permitting and sort of planning section, and that resulted in a reorganization that meant that Sabrina is actually now the manager of that group. So they really had to staff up a lot as part of all the new permitting requirements, but certainly the disproportionately impacted community components are a part of that. So I know that has definitely come with some additional work for their staff.
Yeah, and in particular, I was thinking about the translation. You know, I think that's one that comes up time and time again, that if you're lucky, your department has those resources. How much capacity do you have? Are you even sharing it with other departments? I think, frontline communities, I think especially through the pandemic and rural ones, have made recommendations, I think, about language access and some sort of department within the government or agency or office whose job is language services. I think you see this replicated in other places, but I just thought I'd drop that in there. Well, if anyone doesn't have questions, you feel free to I think connect with Lubna. Lubna, are you the one pulling them together? Just okay, sounds good.
You can feel free to come off mute now or just drop them in the chat. And if you don't want them to be public, you can send them as a direct message to me.
Well, I guess I'll in the meantime we'll switch over to the next person and then get ready. I would say also that I think this kind of assessment, this cumulative assessment they're talking about, I think is something that should go to your committee, Renee, to take a look. I think with this equity and cumulative and then I was thinking this requirement for childcare and translation services. I was thinking that's kind of Ilna Nucete's committee doing the public engagement and then it made me think also, like, do they have vendors to help connect to businesses with, or like it's just like, here, you have to go do this and there's no business assistance either. So those are thoughts I'm going to share there. So the next person we have up to speed, I got to pull up the agenda, apologies, switched off of it, is Kelly Crandall with the PUC.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to present here tonight. Joel, would you mind putting up the slides on definitions? I apologize, I did not have time to put together a separate presentation.
Can we submit questions still as written or, sorry?
Oh yeah, Renee, you can for sure send written ones over to Lubna, or if you want to type them in the chat, she'll take them now too. And
Thank you.
Okay, sounds good.
Well, thank you all. I'm Kelly Crandall. I'm an advisor to the 3 appointed commissioners of the Public Utilities Commission, and I'm working with them on the implementation of Senate Bill 21-272. So the commission regulates a number of entities, including investor-owned electric, gas, and steam utilities, certain transportation providers like taxis, shuttles, transportation network companies, and aspects of gas pipeline and railroad safety. We don't regulate electric cooperatives or municipally run utilities in general. And the team I'm on is the advisory team. We support the commissioners in case management and in making policy decisions based on the evidentiary records in cases. So just one caveat I need to add, because of that role, I can't discuss any open or soon to be open cases. And where I express opinions, they don't represent the commission. And also, I don't think we're as far along in implementation as many of the other agencies here. So I'll talk a little bit about the definition, but then more about some of the ways we might move forward here. So the definition of disproportionately impacted communities came about from Senate Bill 272, which was effective in June of last year. And as you can see, the definition is pretty similar to that used by CDPHE, except for the definition of low income, where they have a single prong in terms of the median household income at or below 200% of federal poverty line. The definition in 272 includes 3 different prongs, including that 200% of federal poverty level, 80% of area median income, and income qualification under DHS energy assistance rules. And so this is kind of actually a nuance that has been raised in some of our rulemaking. So I won't express opinions, but I'll just explain some of the context that we have a separate statutory definition of, quote, low income utility customer that allows for the commission to approve separate rates or charges or services for customers that meet this a level of 185% or below federal poverty level, and that is not considered undue discrimination, and so that can be approved. Whereas in general, treating customers who are of the same class in terms of residential or business or things like that would be prohibited. And so this tends to come into play with things like the percentage of income payment programs that are offered by utilities, in which customers who receive federal energy assistance can also get additional ratepayer funded assistance, so that their gas or electric bills are within a more affordable level of their income than they might otherwise be. And so there's been kind of a question raised as to what definition of low income the commission should generally be using, whether it's the definition in one statute or the definition in 272. And I won't get into any further details on it, but that is part of kind of some of the definitional things we're trying to figure out. So one thing I wanted to raise is, in thinking about the comparison between the definition used by CDPHE and the Public Utilities Commission, there's a question as to, we don't currently have a mapping tool, but could we potentially use EnviroScreen or other tools developed that are already under development? In the initial conversations I've had, and I have had high-level conversations in order to figure out how best to move forward here, I have generally heard there is some interest in efficiencies, and so I think it could be an option to use the same kind of tools CDPHE is creating in commission contexts. We do sometimes incorporate things by reference in our rules. There are maybe a couple things that might be helpful for that to happen, for that to be an option when we get more into a rulemaking, such as, adding a GIS layer that reflects a commission definition if those definitions continue to be different, or understanding the update process, since we have litigated proceedings where perhaps a utility program application uses a map that's effective at one date, and then in the course of implementing the program over years, that map changes. And those are, I think, things that are familiar to CDPHE staff as we've been looking at that tool. But in terms of more specifically how this definition is applied, this is a bit perspective for us. Hypothetically, I think there will be cases where a utility could need to show they're directing program budgets to particular communities once we get through this rulemaking, or maybe working with stakeholders in those communities for outreach. And the definition could also help guide the commission to host workshops or public comment hearings in particular areas. But to just talk a little bit about where we are, the legislation says the commission shall promulgate rules in which it considers how best to provide equity, minimize impacts, and prioritize benefits to disproportionately impacted communities. And in the course of promulgating those rules, define disproportionately impacted communities. So the commission, like these other agencies, may engage in rulemaking as a result of legislation telling us to, because it helps to create transparency for customers and for regulated entities. Perhaps legislation indicates areas where there's more specificity required around what should be provided in cases. So we have not actually started a formal rulemaking process yet. We've been trying to more take our time to understand how we should scope this effort. The legislation says we should consider how best to provide equity in all of our work. To me, that raises questions about what industries that covers. Is that energy utilities? Is that telecommunications? Is that pipeline safety, railroad crossings? A number of industries that the agency works with. We've also been kind of watching how things are evolving at the task force and other activities. So I do expect we will move into a more formal process of stakeholder engagement and information gathering in the future. We, I think, need to better understand how to create a rulemaking, because we have so many rules by industry. We also have practice and procedural rules that sometimes relate to specific types of cases, and that sometimes relate to cases addressed by multiple agencies. And so there's a question, I think, as to which rules we might be opening up and changing in the future, and what kinds of proposed changes we would make. And, we also recognize there's a lot going on for a lot of stakeholders. We also we don't have resources assigned through Senate Bill 272. So we're trying to think of a way to move forward with this that's respectful of stakeholders' time and can be managed with the resources that we have. So I think while the legislation says we need to create rules, I'm not sure exactly when it's going to make sense for us to start that process. My initial thinking at this point is it may not even be until sometime early next year. But we could, as we move forward, identify areas where rules could be addressed more quickly. So having said that, there are a few areas where we are working to make improvements to practices. So expanding our list of possible stakeholders, considering how to provide more plain language materials, testing new meeting formats. And I don't think those are areas that require rules, but are sort of within the spirit of the legislation. And so the example you all raised about interpretation is one that we are looking at and trying to figure out where we can offer more live interpretation at certain meetings. We've traditionally done it upon request, and usually have to have requests in about a week in advance so that can be coordinated, but we're looking at where we can just do that by default in certain situations, depending on the kind of budget we have going forward. And it's a new process and we've had some glitches along the way, but we're trying to become more clear about what kind of opportunities are available in that area. So I will pause there. I see there are some questions and I'm happy to answer any questions you all have.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Ann and Kepi. Certainly appreciate you being here on the call with us this afternoon. It's very fascinating. You talk about Senate Bill 21-272 and just all the work that you all are trying to do as it relates to community engagement. My question, because you brought up a good point around the legislation didn't necessarily add resources to the PUC to like really truly engage. And so I guess my question then is, what are those tactics that you all are doing to try to reach like, faith-based communities that might not necessarily show up to a virtual call or might not necessarily know how to navigate the website to get onto a community meeting? Like, what are those tactics? What are they looking like? Is that part of your timeline process? Because I know that there are quite a few bills that I'm looking about: clean heat, some of the utility plans, the CEP plans, and the ERPs, like capacity wise. So
Hey,
first
Michael,
question is tactics.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but could you back up and say the acronyms you said? Because you said some acronyms and I think it's harder for people. And I also don't think you can translate acronyms, and we need to be aware of that too.
My apologies, and thank you for holding me
Thanks, buddy.
accountable, Ian. No, just like when you talk about the utilities, Excel, Black Hills Energy, and others, particularly the investor-owned utilities. When I talk about CEPs, the Colorado Energy Plan, or the Electric Resource Plan, or even Senate Bill 21-264, which is our clean heat plans, like capacity-wise, in addition to your engagement, how are you all working to get folks involved, understanding that you all are constantly getting bills added to your work plate, and how can we be of assistance to you? So I'll stop there. And I hope I answered some of those acronym gaps. And Kelly, let me know if you want me to further clarify.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And I think that this will be very open for discussion as we try to do more formal engagement, because I think not only does Senate Bill 272 required the commission to take actions with regard to equity, but there were other legislative changes with regard to other state agencies that appear in commission proceedings that now incorporated environmental justice and equity within their missions or practices. And so at this point, we did not have resources added through that specific legislation for this work. We're actually in the process of hiring a section chief on, I believe the title is Media Outreach and Engagement. I may be wrong about that. But at this stage, we're in very early stages of doing what you're talking about. And it's a little more ad hoc than I would like at this point. We're talking about ways that we can become more organized in thinking about how we inform people that cases are being opened, in terms of how we can improve our website, how we can make certain things available in plain language. Some people may have seen a recent proceeding where we held what we called a proceeding overview meeting, still a pretty wonky approach, but we tried to walk through at a high level what was in the rulemaking and what was, what are ways that people can participate in the process. That is definitely easier for us to do in more of a rulemaking context than in an adjudicated case where that may not be able to work that way. But it's very high level. We don't have a specific street. We've certainly heard in conversations with stakeholders that we should be looking for new audiences to inform about proceedings that are going on, think about new ways of hosting events and things like that. We don't have a strategy that I could point to just yet.
Kelly, I appreciate that. And I say that, but I also want to reiterate my point of we're here to help. And so how can we take what you just said and figure out a way to help you better engage? And I know that's not this task force specifically, but I want to be of helpful, and I'm pretty sure a lot of my colleagues on the board would like to be helpful as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can envision as we move into the rulemaking, just as we're talking about the obligations of the commission and we're talking about how we interact with other state agencies, there's talk about the role of regulated entities too. So yeah, I look forward to that conversation.
Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah, that PUC is going to be a beast. I've been engaging with it for like a year and a half, really, right? One of the first EJ coalitions to do so. And I still am not sure I understand all the different things that happen at the PUC. And, you know, I think it's good for you all to be trying to have a plan. And I think when Michael's saying, what do you need? I'm hearing resources. I think that's the kind of recommendations that we could make. And very specific kind of departments are targeted for things that you actually need. So I think that leaves Robin up next, right? Oh, go ahead, Kelly.
I was just going to say, yeah, thank you all for inviting me to be here today. I appreciate it.
Oh, Peyton is next. Okay, thanks, Joel.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for the introductions and sharing your lived experiences and for having me here. So my name is Peyton. I work for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I coordinate the Centennial Program, which offers discounted passes and licenses to Coloradans who fall below the poverty line. Colorado Parks and Wildlife's mission is to perpetuate wildlife resources of the state and provide a quality parks, state park system and recreation opportunities to current generations and generations to come. So our definition of disproportionately impacted communities is very similar to CDPHE's. It includes 40% housing cost burdened, 40% low income groups, 40% minority groups, and then if there's a history of environmental racism, as well as cumulative impacts. And this comes from Senate Bill 21-249. We are still in the process of implementing this bill to come out with the Keep Colorado Wild Pass. So I want to walk you through the steps that we're taking to engage with disproportionately impacted communities, and then what that's going to look like until the pass comes out next January. And then just a question, is it okay to say DI communities, or should I say it without the acronym every time?
So in Spanish, DI communities is comunidades afectadas en manera desproporcionadas. So it really expands it quite a bit. So if you're able to just say the full thing each time, it's a lot easier for our interpreters.
I will. Thank you, Joel. Okay. Wonderful. So what is the Keep Colorado Wild Pass? So this is a pass that came through legislation, and Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Revenue are working together to come out with a pass that is half the price of the original pass, which is right now $80. So it'll be set at $40 or less, so that more Coloradans, when they register their vehicles, are able to buy an affordable parks pass and experience more recreation outside. Okay, so currently we have a bid out for a consultant to help with our disproportionately impacted communities outreach. And we will be evaluating these bids that have been submitted in early April. What we were looking for from our consultants is that they're able to collaborate with Colorado Parks and Wildlife to identify and consult with organizations that represent households and communities with limited resources. And then secondly, they will design and implement an outreach program to gather input from disproportionately impacted communities, applying the outlined guidelines. Next, they will collaborate with our agency to design and implement opportunities for disproportionately impacted communities to provide input using multiple methods, including but not limited to events, comment forums, and/or interviews and focus groups. So we're trying to have a heavy mix of in-person events as well as things that are accessible online. And then, let's see. Ultimately, we want to develop and maintain an organization and community member contact list so that we can have communication to keep members on this list informed of activities, updates, opportunities to comment, and decisions throughout the planning process. So this process will start in May of this year. And then between June and July, we will begin the outreach with our consultants. July 1, we have to begin public outreach, and that is in the Senate bill. And then in September, the consultant will present their findings on the price point for disproportionately impacted communities to our commission and then the commission will review draft regulations to set the Keep Colorado reduced pass fee. And this will be set on October 12th. And then in November, our commission will finalize the reduced pass fee. And then I wanted to discuss disproportionately impacted community efforts. Yes, Jason, so they did set it at 29, but that's just for general Coloradans. But then for disproportionately impacted communities, it will be set lower than $29. Currently, we offer a discounted parks pass for income eligible Coloradans at 14. So I imagine it would be more around that price point. Does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. So other efforts that exist outside of the Keep Colorado Wild Pass, we do have programs for individuals with disabilities, veterans with service-connected disabilities, individuals who fall below the poverty guidelines, and then outdoor equity grant program. And then recently we have added a feature to our database that prompts customers to report their ethnicity if they choose, so that our agency can continue creating programs and provide educational opportunities that resonate with all Coloradans. And that is all I have. Does anyone else have more questions?
With that survey data that you were talking about there at the end, they can choose their ethnicity. Can they also choose their language?
I believe so. So I'm not mostly on the survey team, so I'm not fully sure. I do know that our marketing team is working heavily in getting it out in Spanish. And I think they want to mail it out in Spanish as well as send it out in Spanish virtually. We already had one survey go through just for the initial price point, and I believe that was in Spanish and English. There were no other languages available. And then the survey that's going out to disproportionately impacted community, I think they are wanting to put it in Spanish as well.
Any other questions?
And Ian, do you suggest any other languages that we should put it out in?
Well, I think that depends where you're trying to target and the two most spoken languages. I think that has a lot to do with what we've asked for when it comes to like air monitoring and air notifications. And I think, you know, Peyton, I would say there's a subcommittee for public engagement that you can go to, and they're just talking, that's all they're talking about, and they're putting out RFA, and they're doing all sorts of cool stuff over there.
Thank you.
And I think that I personally hope that these like spaces become ways to build those connections where, you know, we can get to the best practices you're talking about and be able to bring real examples. Like I think we've seen that too, right? With recently Cherokee gas plant was brought forward and reopening permits, like they're like real examples. And I think when we can work on real life examples, it helps better everything.
Definitely, I agree. Thank you.
So Robin, maybe you want to start getting it going if no one has any questions.
Sure, happy to. I also want to flag that it's 5:15 and my kids just got home, and so it's like meltdown central in my house right now. So I really apologize if you hear screaming. I promise my husband is just trying to feed them. So, but they're loud. But I'm going to do my best. So I did not prepare a PowerPoint because I don't love PowerPoint and reading people's slides. And so I apologize that you have only to look at the slides that Joel prepared, but I really appreciate the EJ units slide that they created that walks through the different definitions that exist and how they're applied, which I think for me really highlights the need for this subcommittee and the work that we're doing. So I just want to express my gratitude as an employee of an agency that has to implement this, that for all of your time and effort in helping us do this better. So the term disproportionately impacted community in the CDPHE universe is new from the Environmental Justice Act last year, but it's not a new concept. The permitting team has an existing guidance document for health equity and environmental justice, which tried to help them conduct additional outreach or conduct additional analysis for permits that were what we would consider sort of environmental justice related permits. And I think that was our first attempt to really get at this broader concept that we're really looking at globally now. So when the first piece of the DI community work, as you guys know, was the creation of the map that Joel's group worked with our toxicology and environmental epidemiology office to build last fall. And that was focused on these first three prongs of the definition. And Joel's group and the TEO and other folks have been working really hard to build out the more qualitative pieces of the definition of DI community, because it is so important for a great number of our programs and our work that we have clarity on where these communities are and that we identify them appropriately. And so there's a lot of different places where the definition comes into play, and they're not all within the Air Pollution Control Division. So the Environmental Justice Unit that is running this task force, right? That the definition of DI community is going to help us identify, helped us identify some eligibility criteria for those serving on this task force, on the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and for the person who has been appointed as ombudsperson. And I don't want Joel and Lebna to cringe, as I probably inaccurately or incompletely describe all of the work as it pertains to them. So I will, before I turn to the more error division and error commission specific pieces, phone a friend and ask Joel and Lebna if they have any additional thoughts. So what the Environmental Justice Act did was really try to focus a lot of our work on the people who lived in disproportionately impacted communities. And a really critical piece of that was establishing better communication pathways. And so that is a lot of the work of all three of the groups I just mentioned, this task force, the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and the ombudsperson, and more broadly, the EJ unit itself. Also, the ombudsperson, is tasked with creating not only better communication overall, but really a pathway for a complaint system. We know here at the ER Division that the communities are not satisfied with our response to their complaints about pollution they see, that they smell, that they hear, right, that they taste in the water. And so, this ombudsperson, one of his new responsibilities is going to be to help us do better in that very important area. So I'm going to stop and just let Joel and Lebna, call out how this definition and the scope of the definition really could impact their work, since they know their work a lot better than me. I'm going to be better on the Air Division and Air Commission specific pieces.
Sure. Well, I can just quickly say that in addition to what's listed here on the slide, we do use the definition of disproportionately impacted community in the Environmental Justice Act to kind of guide the work we do with the other divisions as well, water, waste, and sustainability. And for example, the water division has sort of proposed to formally incorporate essentially the DI community definition, and it's I just use the acronym, sorry, the definition of disproportionately impacted community in its upcoming direct potable reuse rulemaking. And so I think that's one example of many where we're trying to use the definition informally. The Division of Environmental Health and Sustainability has a small business green grants program that essentially gives out grants to small businesses, mostly restaurants, to upgrade their equipment to be more energy efficient. They're using the definition to guide where they spend the grant funding. So I would just say that beyond what's required in the statutes, many parts of the state health department are using the definition to guide our work to prioritize it in disproportionately impacted communities. And I guess I would also be remiss if I didn't say that the memorandum of understanding that the state health department signed with the federal Environmental Protection Agency yesterday to prioritize enforcement in disproportionately impacted communities will also use that our state definition as well as the federal definition. So I think that that's a long way of saying we use it for many purposes that go beyond the scope of just what's in the statute. And I know we're a little over time, so I will not say any more and turn it back to Robin.
Sure. And I can try to go quickly, but I do want to, well, first, thank you, Joel. And then I do want to say that the Air Division is trying to honor also the idea that the definition of DI communities informs our work as a floor, and we should consider where we can prioritize these communities even outside of where we're directed to by statute, and we are working on that actively. So I'm going to talk just for a minute about the Air Commission. So there's a piece of the Environmental Justice Act that directs more engagement with the Commission office with disproportionately impacted communities. Most people think it's just rulemaking, And certainly when a formal rulemaking action is commenced, the commission will hold multiple public hearings, and we have commissioners that are giving additional of their time because they're volunteers already, to do nights and weekends and really try to engage more and hear back from the community, as opposed to just the public comment option during the commission hearings. But that section of the statute also applies to two other areas of commission action. So one would be when consideration of a permit goes to the commission. Most commonly, that happens when a Title V permit is a draft is put out by the Air Division. Anybody under our regulations can request a hearing before the commission. And so the requirements of the Environmental Justice Act, as it pertains to disproportionately impacted communities, comes into play because that dictates some of the outreach requirements that will apply on those permitted public hearings. So for example, the Suncor Title V permit public hearings. Another area is an enforcement action. Now, if the division issues a compliance order to an emission source, that source has the opportunity to appeal that order to the Air Commission. I've been in and around the division for about 10 years, and I've seen appeals happen, but I've only seen one hearing go all the way through to conclusion. But should that happen in the future, and should that emission source that's the subject of the compliance order be in and around a disproportionately impacted community, there would be more outreach with the community surrounding that compliance action. Other existing work by the division, we are currently evaluating how to rework these existing guidelines I spoke about earlier. So also as it pertains to permitting for our health equity and environmental justice guidelines to be more robust and align more closely with the Environmental Justice Act, and focusing on the definition of DI communities and the scope of that definition. And certainly going to, while the Environmental Justice Act doesn't require the Air Division to engage more with communities in the processing of permits, that is certainly one area where we are looking to really make strides, in particular for permits that impact or affect disproportionately impacted communities. And that work is ongoing. One area where the Environmental Justice Act does direct future upcoming action in the permitting context is, I think there's two. So one is that the commission next year is going to consider new requirements for new and modified sources of industrial pollution in disproportionately impacted communities. And the commission is directed to establish new modeling and monitoring requirements. And so it's possible that the work of this task force is going to inform the scope of that rulemaking, because we anticipate that rulemaking will be in 2023. And so hopefully we will have some good recommendations to give to the Air Division and the Air Commission coming out of this subcommittee on the scope that will inform the scope of that new permitting rule. As Ian mentioned, and we talked about some in our last task force meeting, there is also authority for the Air Division to revisit certain permits, existing permits in disproportionately impacted communities. And so once the commission sort of establishes this new modeling and monitoring program for new and modified sources, the division intends to evaluate how to implement some of those requirements at existing sources. And that, again, so our work about the scope of the definition of disproportionately impacted community is going to really inform not just new and modified permits, but also existing permits for sources of industrial pollution. So for those of you who participated in our oil and gas rulemaking last fall, first, thank you. And second, hopefully what you can see coming out of that rulemaking is that the definition and the scope of the definition of disproportionately impacted community had a huge impact on that rulemaking, because in every single section of that rule, we either required, or the commission either required earlier implementation of emission reductions, more implementation of emission reductions, more frequent inspections of oil and gas sites, etc. And earlier that year, the commission adopted a industrial source audit program. It's known as the GEM, G-E-M-M rule. And that also directed, consideration and prioritization of reductions in disproportionately impacted communities. And the industrial and manufacturing rule, the GEM rule, and the pieces of the oil and gas rule created this concept that we haven't really required before, which is the actual quantification of the co-benefits of the benefits to the people who live in disproportionately impacted communities, because we are trying to create and build more transparency for people who live in these communities about the emissions and any additional benefits that are directed to those communities. And last, I'm sorry, Joel, I'm trying not to take too much time, but the last piece, as Joel points out in the table, is we really revise a lot of our reporting requirements to make sure that there's more transparency and clarity around which sources, and so which data that we receive relates to sources in disproportionately impacted communities. And our intent there, and I want to call out and thank Ian specifically for helping us sort of crystallize around this, which is us getting a lot of data isn't that helpful if we don't summarize and present that data in an understandable way. And so we are looking to see what work we can do with respect to our emissions inventories and reports that we're getting in service of that end. And the scope of DI community is important because it does have additional reporting obligations on some of these sources. So I've rambled quite a lot and I'll stop for questions. So thank you for your time.
No questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Robin, for the thank you. I appreciate that. I think that
I
I've
got
said-
just a comment, and
Oh, go ahead, stop.
nice work, Robin, and nice work to the entire department. It was a compliment, not a comment, not a comment. Great work. That's it.
I have a question.
Thank you.
Maybe just for curiosity too, if an existing permit is modified pursuant to this new provision that allows sort of revisiting existing permits to include additional monitoring, and that permit is a Title V permit, does that mean it has to go back to the EPA for approval, or will it have to go through sort of additional public engagement steps in that revisiting process?
Thanks, Becca, and hi. Nice to hear you.
Hi.
I think if I remember correctly, that section doesn't apply to renewable operating permits. I could be getting that wrong.
Right. Construction permits. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Going back to the agenda here. I think that's everyone that we had here to speak. So I want to say thanks again, and just remind anybody, if anyone has any questions, to get them over to Lubna and we can get them answered. I do also want to just take a moment to announce, that Katie Dickinson here, who's in the audience, she has Masters in Public Health graduate students that have signed up to be research assistants for us in any sort of kind of way that we think we may need. So, as you're taking notes, if something comes up, I think that'd be good. I don't know, Katie, if you want to say anything about that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. It's been great to listen in. I'm actually in Washington, D.C. right now for this National Environmental Justice Conference. It's been really, really quite interesting. Learning a lot about cumulative impacts assessments through NEPA today. So always learning. So yeah, Hannah Walters, Jason Youngsmith, and Haley Holan are all on the call today, or have been at different moments. I don't know if Jason's still here. And they are in my environmental policy class this semester and doing a project that, yeah, basically they're here to support the work that this subcommittee is doing specifically. They are, I think one of the things that they're interested in looking at is sort of the benefits side. So when we're thinking about, harms that fall on disproportionately impacted communities, also thinking about where the benefits generated in those communities go, and how we can start shining a light on things like who are the stakeholders and the shareholders for businesses that are located in disproportionately impacted communities. So that was a suggestion that has come out of some conversations we've had with Lubna and others, but we are definitely open to redirecting or modifying that. The three students that are working here, Hannah and Haley and Jason, have great GIS skills, and again are just really interested in doing a project that helps to support this work and bring some of their great data skills to bear. And just want to say that, yeah, it's been as someone who had the privilege of working with some of the folks that worked on 1266. It's really exciting and humbling to see this work happening. And I am really grateful to be able to listen in. And as others have said, especially at the beginning, Renee and Ian, Tyson, and all of you sharing kind of where you're coming from. That it's I really appreciate that. Again, I'm learning a lot from being here and listening to all of you.
Well, great. Thanks for that, Katie. And let's just keep thinking about if we want to use these awesome resources. I've partnered with the students before on research, and it's been very fruitful for the work that's developed to get us to here. The next thing we're going to go to is we're going to get a demo of the tools that all of these definitions add up to, and what we can use for the government to help us figure out where we need to do more work. So with the Enviro screen, Joel, I'll give it to you. Oh, and I did want to remind you, Joel, to maybe speak just a little bit slower. I think the last time you were on, it went a little fast, and I know those words are more difficult, the long ones.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I always need those reminders. It's a constant work for me. So this is Colorado Enviro Screen. So thanks for that intro. And I do just want to also acknowledge that we have Dr. David Rojas, who is a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board and a professor at Colorado State University with us in the audience today. David is the lead developer of Colorado Enviro Screen. So it's great to have him here. And I think when we get to the question and answer, he can probably help me with answering questions that will likely be beyond my knowledge. So the task force members, you all received an invitation to test out Enviro Screen. It's still in the beta phase. We started out in a closed wave beta, which we actually finished last week, and we'll have a public beta testing in April where all members of the public will have a chance to test out Enviro Screen. So this is what the site looks like. We'll kind of keep working on refining the images and some of the text that's here at the top of the page. So this is really pretty simple in the beta version. So know that will get a lot more detailed, and we'll build a lot more in and as we continue to develop it. But I do just want to kind of show you some of the key things that are in the tool. First, the first section of the page is really just a guide to using EnviroScreen. It tells you about what the score means, how to use the interactive map below, a little bit more about what types of data is built in, a sort of example of how you could use the tool, and then links to additional content, which we have not yet built in. But really the core of the tool is this, it's the interactive map. Something that I want to highlight is that there are 3 geographic scales built into the map, which are the county level, the census tract level, and the census block group level. So I'll kind of turn it on to the census block group level, and you can see that instead of showing all the counties in Colorado, if I click update map over here, it will turn on all the different census block groups across the state. You can also look at different types of indicators or layers. So the default is the overall score, which combines, using a mathematical formula, all the other indicators. But you can also look at individual components. Those are grouped into 5 categories, which are environmental exposures. Those are things that we breathe in or drink directly, things that we're directly exposed to in our environment. Environmental effects, those are things that exist in our environment, but we might not actually be exposed to them in a way that impacts our health if everything is going right at those facilities. Climate vulnerabilities, so areas where there's additional climate risks. Sensitive populations, so those are groups who are more susceptible to different types of environmental health risks, such as people over 65 or people under 5. And finally, demographics, which are different socioeconomic indicators of population groups who may be more vulnerable to some of the environmental health risks that are built into the tool. So you can turn on just any one of those 5 categories. We group them together overall into sort of the pollution and climate burden, as well as sort of socioeconomic and demographics. And then you can also look at a bunch of different indicators that are built into each one of the different exposures. I'll just click on ozone here to highlight that when you turn on one of those individual indicators, it will tell you what it means. So if it's not immediately intuitive what it is, then you can turn that on and learn a little bit more about ozone, for example, an air pollutant. If you want to just see that indicator, on the map, you can come over here to update map, click it, it will take a moment to update, and then you can sort of zoom in and see the sort of ozone risk for different areas. I'm going to go back to the overall EnviroScreen score and just kind of play around in the map a little bit. One thing to note, there is a search feature if you click this magnifying glass. So I'm just going to search for a familiar address, which is my grandparents' address when I was growing up. So we'll zoom in here on where they lived in Lahana. So if you ever want to search for somewhere in the map, you can kind of do that to find a specific area. Zooming out here in Otero County a little bit, I'll kind of show you some things about the map. So one is, note that the scale has areas that have the highest burden or the highest score. So more pollution or more vulnerability are a lighter color. Areas with less burden are a dark color. So for example, here in kind of North Lahana, on the east side of town, there's a higher burden. It's actually in the 99th percentile, that census block group overall in the whole state. So it has one of the highest overall EnviroScreen scores. Down here by Otero Junior College, it's sort of a wealthier area of town. It has a much lower score. So it's in just the 6th percentile overall. So you can see that variability just in one small town in Colorado. Another thing to note is that we do have the current definition of disproportionately impacted community built into the tool. Of course, it disconnected me from the server right as I was trying to show you that. But this is the same map that is available on our website that shows just the communities that meet the demographic component of the definition. So probably looks very familiar to you all. So we can come back here to Lahana. You can kind of see some areas meet the definition under the income category, some areas under the percentage people of color category, some under housing cost burden. Maybe if we get out to Pueblo or the Springs, you can see that. And then more than one category is purple. If you ever want to kind of see how that overlays with the overall EnviroScreen score, you just click here to turn back on that indicator score. And sorry, I'm not in census block group anymore. So, but you can then see sort of some of the communities that have a high pollution, a high burden, and a higher EnviroScreen score, like that 99th percentile one. does also meet the definition of disproportionately impacted community under sort of the more than one factor, that purple prong. So just an example of what you can do to play around in the tool. Leaving that same census block group highlighted, if you come down here in our nice Broncos colors tables down here, you can see the reasons that each individual census block group may meet the definition. So what percentile that area falls in. So actually that census block group in La Junta is relatively low in the environmental exposures and effects categories, as well as climate vulnerability, but is very high in the sort of sensitive populations and demographics categories under those socioeconomic prongs. And let me just come up here to Pueblo. We'll zoom in on an area that probably has right near the steel mill and has a high EnviroScreen score, 93rd percentile. You can see it scores much higher on environmental exposures and environmental effects, not very climate vulnerable. It's not likely to be susceptible to things like wildfire and flood, but is pretty high up in the indicators in terms of demographics, though not socioeconomic sensitive populations. So that's just one example of how you can kind of compare and see how a score is calculated. If you're really into the data, you can come down here. So I'm just gonna kind of clear the map. And you can sort of sort all areas in the state by their EnviroScreen score. If you kind of want to compare EnviroScreen scores across the state, you can sort of sort by individual indicators. So if I come down to environmental effects, actually I'll do environmental exposures. If I want to see the areas maybe with the most particulate matter from diesel risk throughout the state, you can kind of find those. If you I'll just select this census block group in Adams County. If you select a census block group in these data tables and come back up to the map, it will actually be highlighted on the map. So we'll be able to see that. So let's see that one. Okay, it didn't work this time. There's a few works in progress, but usually if you, I didn't click highlight selection on the map. You can use that highlight section on the map to then highlight it. So that area that has high particulate matter exposure, one of the highest in the states, is this area. I think it's unincorporated Adams County, right at the intersection of the Turnpike, US 76, I-25, and 270. So lots of highways in that area. It's unsurprising it has a high score. So easy to play around, and kind of you can use the data tables and go back and forth with the map to see the areas that you're clicking on. The last thing I do want to highlight is that you are also able to download the data for census block groups. If you really want to do a lot of number crunching on your own, you can. So I think that was everything I wanted to show in the tool. Are there any questions about that?
It's great to see the tool like in action, the way that you shared it there. My question is maybe a little bit more about what, how other state agencies might be using this. Maybe, I'm sorry, I have my baby here. Maybe even at least the other agencies that have more of the qualitative factors included in their definition. Or maybe even like agencies like CDOT, where their definition is more census-based, but just, yeah, curious how other state, whether there's any plans for other state agencies to use the tool.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we certainly hope so. We've certainly involved many different state agencies in the invitations for beta testing and to provide public input over the fall, and we really do want to make sure that the tool, we did some sort of stakeholder interviews with state agency staff, and we want to make sure that the tool is useful for all of our state agencies, and try to build in indicators that are relevant for them as much as possible. It's still in the beta version, it's not final, so I don't know how other agencies will use it. And maybe if I can make a friendly process question, we will have a public comment section later in the agenda that I want to make sure we leave enough time for. So if kind of folks who are not members of the task force are okay, that makes sense to you, Ian, we can sort of save those questions for the public comment and just stick to task force questions for now, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking that, to make sure we have the full public comment time, I know we have a second item on here that is to look at this historical narratives. I want to give that the time it deserves, and I don't think in 9 minutes we're going to be able to talk about the history. So I recommend that we move that to the next meeting that we participate in. And I don't know how everyone else would feel. It sounds like we have a couple mothers in the room, and should we take a 5-minute break before we start as well? I think that could be a nice thing to do before public comment. So if there's other questions, I do want them to be asked for Joel. One of the questions I have is about accessibility. What kind of accessibility is being built into this for people beyond language, for people have reading issues, right, or sight issues. I think some of that's been brought to my attention through this process a lot more.
That's a great question, Ian. As you mentioned, the tool will be available in both English and Spanish. It is only available in English in the beta version, but when we go public in June, it will be in both languages. David, I might call on you for that. Do you know of sort of things that we are doing in the development process to sort of make the tool accessible to people who might have disabilities or sort of challenges with using sort of an electronic tool like this? I don't know of any off the top of my head, but that might be a better question for you.
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everyone. So just in the map visualization, so the most challenging often is the color gradient. So what we decide to use is there's best practices for people with disabilities in terms of the colors, and I'm colorblind, so I was the one also testing this tool that the gradient of the colors makes sense. So just using one single color with different intensities to help to distinguish the different geographical areas. So we are embedded that kind of best practices when you're presenting data and different colors when you want to compare geographies. The size of the font and the font itself. The font is the specific font for the CDPHE. So we are using that font by default because it's a tool from the department. But the size of the font could be changed, and this is the beta version, and we have a lot of information that to be included. So if you have any suggestions in terms of the size of the font, probably we can definitely increase that. Many of the devices and the screens are offering already the possibility to enhance that font size. We also have in the base map layers, the default value is a white map. But for those that have also more challenging to reading things and visualizing lines, there is an option that is a dark base map. So you can identify more the contrast between the information in the map. Thank you, Joel, for clicking that option. So we have embedded many of the best practices that exist for displaying maps and information for people with different abilities for this type of tools.
Well, thank you, David, for that explanation. I really appreciate that. I think I didn't know all of that, so that's great to know. I do want to give everyone 5 minutes. I think that would be nice to get prepared for the public comments switched over. If people have additional questions, I know that they're gathering them. I want to make sure that they're all answered, and we'll definitely make sure they're posted as well. And then when we get the answers, that'll be posted too. So I'm gonna go off camera and I'm gonna go grab myself some water, and I'll see you all back here in just a couple minutes. Okay. It is 6 o'clock. Here on the agenda, start the public comment, really public dialogue. I think that we can go ahead and have people raise their hand if they'd like to say or address the task force members. I do want it to be open for people to have a conversation back and forth. I think we've kind of started having those kind of meeting norms in our other meetings, and I think it's a good practice that I like to see that we've seen it, at the state legislature. So if anybody wants to, you can feel free. If there's no one that raises their hand from the public, if we want to have open dialogue about what we heard, I think that could be good too. Well, Katie, would you like to talk? I see Tyson, I saw you just come off.
Yeah, I was just going to say I want to thank everybody who presented, and I know some of those people aren't here anymore, but it really helps to get a good broad idea. One of the main tasks of this task force is to kind of give the recommendation of whether, there should be a single or multiple definitions. And I think I at least got a lot of insight on the usefulness of having a singular definition. And I also got a lot of insight on how difficult that may be in some cases. So it was I very much appreciate everyone who presented and will answer questions for us in the future.
Yeah, again, I just want to reiterate, if there's anybody in the audience who wants to say anything, you're more than welcome to, just come raise your hand or come off mute. Go ahead.
Sure, I'll chime in. So yeah, again, I'm just really happy to be hearing the progress and seeing how this is playing out in all these different spaces. I mean, I think having been able to be a part of the GCC conversation when that was just getting started, and then seeing how this is playing out in all these different areas. I did mention about this national conference, and I was talking to somebody, and they said, "Oh, we've heard that Colorado is doing, some it has some new work going on in environmental justice." So I think we're really putting ourselves on the map with the innovative approaches that we're all taking. I think that one question that I've had from the beginning is kind of like Tyson was just saying, is it I think when we were coming up with the 1266 definition, we knew that it wasn't the right one. Particularly the census only version of that. But because this work needs to get started, we felt like we've got to put a definition out there that people can start with and run with, and then there needs to be a process for updating it. And so that's exactly where we are here. But I think as we're, I think that's been a question that I've had too, and just an encouragement to this this body, is to provide a path so that when your work is done, there is an operational definition, and maybe it is a flexible definition, maybe it is certain things toggle on and off for different applications, because the purpose, I think the question really needs to be, what is the definition being used for? And so we can't wait for the perfect definition to move forward on the action that we know needs to happen. But I think we also need to allow for flexibility and updating periodically. I know we've talked about that a little bit with David and his team, like how often does the data that goes into EnviroScreen get updated, and how often does is the definition itself revisited? because I do think it's going to be, it could be paralyzing to try and put absolutely everything in at the beginning. But yeah, I mean, I think again, it's just really exciting to see the work moving forward. And yeah, I'm just, again, reiterating that anything that our team in the School of Public Health can do to support the work that you all are doing, we would love to continue our partnership.
I think I saw someone raise their hand briefly as well. I don't know if they still want to get in. It was pretty fast. So Katie, I have a question about kind of like the definition. You talk about keeping the data up to date, and I think there are people who are putting in water or data that's not available. Can you talk about what kind of like real resources that takes? Like how much time does it really take to build a database or a tool? And if you set a definition at 30% or 40% or 50%, what does that really mean for like a change in of the people who are building and updating the tools to make them relevant?
That's a really great question. And again, something I'm not going to have a great answer for it, except that, there are certain things like, every X years, the census data that goes into the tool needs to be updated. That's easy, right? That's a new pull of the data, and it will make things shift, right? We know that populations are mobile, and we have, change happening in neighborhoods. Gentrification is going to change the map in certain ways, and that's something I think that is a tricky part of this. So one type of updating is it's the same data, the same variables, the same data sources, and you're just updating because the world is changing. The other question is, how do you bring in new data, right? New sources of data, new types of data to be more comprehensive in what's captured. And that's certainly going to be a more involved process. But I think both are really necessary. And, I know that there's another subcommittee looking at data and data sharing, and Ian, something that we've talked about a lot in our work together is data justice. And so I think part of what's happening as we're moving the conversation on environmental justice is looking at data justice and looking at what do we measure, right? We measure the things we care about. And as a society, there are many things, Renee, I think your point about erasure, this is a part of that for me, is that we just have vast areas where we don't have data, not because things aren't measurable, but because we haven't invested in measuring them. And so if that's a part of the change that we're looking for, is to systematically invest in measuring a broader range of things that we should care about, and many of us do care about, that finding ways for that to then come into this type of tool is important. And that's not going to happen automatically, and it's not going to happen for free.